This week, the jury in Erin Patterson's months-long triple murder trial returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. But rather than draw a line under a case that's held the fevered fascination of Australian and international audiences, the verdict seems to have only fuelled interest, spawning more and more coverage and conjecture. Today I'm talking to editor Lenore Taylor and national news editor Josephine Tovey on the ethics of covering the mushroom trial and where to draw the line between public interest and ghoulish fascination. Good morning, Lenore.
Morning, Reged.
Good morning, Jo.
Good morning, Reged.
Look, there's been so much global attention on this case, local, international media outlets covering it. There were podcasters, authors, and a TV drama team. Didn't know about that. What is the fascination with the case of Erin Patterson?
That's a good question. And I guess a cynic might say that having exhausted everything we could possibly write or say about the mushroom trial, we're now doing a podcast about why we're all interested in the mushroom trial. However, the interest is so exponentially bigger than in many other murder trials that are also interesting and gnarly that I think it is a valid discussion for a podcast. And I think there's lots of reasons. Like, it feels like a TV drama, right? It's like Midsummer Murders meets Agatha Christie. A very ordinary kind of everyday woman commits a crime in a very bizarre way. There's an element of uncertainty because the prosecution never really sort of got to a motive for what she did. And so there's a lot to speculate about and everybody's speculating. And I guess it's a point of commonality. You know, we're all talking about it. So in a world where there's not a lot of points of commonality, it is that point. I don't know if that sufficiently explains it, but that's my best guess.
Jo?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we could do a whole podcast series on why people are obsessed with true crime, why people are obsessed with this case. I mean, I think this case in particular, compared to even the huge interest that there is in true crime in general, it's sort of an interesting case in that there's the elements that Lenore mentioned, that it really sort of feels like a murder mystery, small town, an innocuous seeming
with a dark
woman.
secret.
But it also has these elements of sort of Australian kitsch about it, like the fact that there was a recipe from Recipe Tin Eats. Like, is there anything more kind of quintessentially Middle Australia than, mum getting a recipe off Recipe Tin Eats for Sunday lunch? I think it's also, as far as true crime stories go, it's sort of deceptively benign in a way. Like, it is not a murder where people were hacked to death. I think people have sort of reached for Agatha Christie and Midsummer Murders as references because they're not the sort of hard-boiled, super grisly crime. I think some of that conceals, though, that this has been a horrific crime that has shattered a couple of families and that 3 people died very painful deaths. But I think on the face of it, it has seemed like a more sort of quirky, almost kitsch story for the media to latch onto and for the public to latch onto.
I also think there's something about a woman cooking a meal, which is normally a nurturing thing to do, and actually using the meal as a murder weapon. There's something about that juxtaposition that people find horrifying, fascinating. I don't know.
Is there also an element of the obsessive interest being a bit of an escape from the other news that are around?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. And, you know, with the caveat that this is a grisly case where 3 people died. But I think if you look at the broader news agenda at the moment, the news from Gaza, what the Trump administration is doing, you know, climate news, all of it, it's sort of relentlessly awful, and it feels like news without an end. We don't see any justice coming. We don't see any resolution coming. This was sort of a neat, contained narrative story. Here is the alleged perpetrator. Here are the victims. This is the course of the trial. We're going to get a clear yes or no answer at the end of it. That's a very appealing kind of story for people to latch onto in a time when there is sort of an unending awfulness about the world at the moment.
And possibly it's also a crime. It's like some murders, some crimes are things that make you a bit afraid, that you think could possibly happen to you or someone you know. But this is so bizarre and so strange. It feels removed from your own everyday experience or life.
That's right. Like, I don't share the true crime obsession that a lot of women my age feel, like, you know, the kind of the grisly murders of women, backpacker murders, that type of stuff, partly because I find it so unsettling. It makes me feel more afraid about traveling alone at night or doing things like that. Like, we live with real fears about violence and sexual violence. This case had none of those fears.
You can be pretty sure this isn't going to happen.
I don't think so. Fingers crossed for my weekend lunch. But yeah, it felt removed enough that it doesn't make you feel afraid. It sort of operates at a distance.
We will come to some of the seriousness around it, the victims, as you mentioned, but there was a very wide breadth and depth of reporting, especially since the verdict. Has it been a bit of a media circus?
I think you would struggle to suggest it was not a media circus. There were podcasters, TikTokers, members of the public, reporters from every media outlet, including our own. The appetite was insatiable. And since the verdict, I think that circus has sort of turned a corner or turned into something else, which is kind of plethora of stories by psychologists and amateur psychologists to fill in that missing link of what was the motive, which we still really don't know. You know, one newspaper ran an actual psychologist saying she was pretty sure that Erin Patterson, the perpetrator, was a narcissist. One newspaper said that they knew for sure that this was a crime of coercive control, not that it was a theory, but that we definitely knew that this was coercive control and we just weren't admitting it because it was a woman. I guess when we get to the sentencing I think it's in August or September, there will be actual psychological assessments of people who've actually spoken to Erin Patterson, and maybe some of all of these theories will be shown to be correct or false. But at the moment, it's kind of morphed into a frenzy of speculation about why she did it now that the jury has determined that she did it.
Yeah, I think the media industry around this is like nothing we've ever seen before. And the court even put out a statement earlier this week saying as much, that this was an unprecedented level of interest. I thought one thing that was particularly interesting about this case, with all of the podcasting in particular, like that was its own kind of mini industry that evolved around this case. And that was all happening in real time. Like, we're very used to a flourishing true crime podcast industry, and The Guardian has created a number of true crime podcasts. They tend to be cold cases or cases, cases from the past. But this was one of the first times I can remember where we've seen in real time daily news podcasts about a court case, which is very challenging in Australia.
Yes.
It's ongoing and challenging given that you cannot you can't broadcast a case in Australia. So they've had to create content daily with no actual audio visual material from the courtroom itself. It's been an incredible exercise.
And there are things that all reporters learn about court reporting, about what evidence you can report, what evidence you can't report, about what the sub judice rules are. And I think some media organisations and some non-media organisations breached those rules, and breaching those rules can lead to trials being aborted. I mean, those rules are in place for serious reasons. So I think the court said there were multiple directions, both to mainstream established media organisations and also social media reporters, if you like, to remove some material. I think at least one show, Kyle and Jackie O's show, has been referred for prosecution for contempt after comments that were made on air during the course of the trial. So I think this kind of a saturation coverage does also raise questions about real-time reporting of court and the rules around it, and the dangers of doing that in a way when you don't understand the rules.
There were some examples of maybe what could be described as questionable coverage.
Yeah, that's right. There were moments where I'm not sure the industry covered itself in glory. A couple of things that stand out to me were, the first was I just found it a bit funny after the verdict came through that we saw a lot of stories saying, see the meal, because we got released in the exhibits the pictures of the discarded beef Wellingtons. I mean, have a look at a half-eaten beef Wellington is a objectively funny headline.
However, everybody did. It was a top rating story on our site.
Yes. And we also ran the pictures, I would note. So I'm not above it, but I just think it's objectively funny. And I guess I would also have to mention probably the story that did more traffic in group chats this week than any other, which was this very bizarre take by a Daily Mail writer, a very kind of long, circuitous colour piece about what it was like to cover the trial that ended with him revealing that his wife had left him and that he was the last sad victim of Erin Patterson, which, yeah, no words.
It was about him.
I know there was some analysis saying on the flip side there was a positive element because it demystified the justice system in a way.
Yeah, actually one of the, we're critical of some of the hot takes around this, but I thought that one hot take that I really liked was a Malcolm Knox piece in the SMH that said that following this case sort of reinforced the fact that we do still, at least in some places, live in a sort of a rules-based order and that facts do matter. And I thought that was really interesting to see. We were all kind of following the very detailed, tight process of this case. Yes, there were commentators that may have breached those rules, but, that the court was onto that, and that we saw how, you build a case through facts and evidence and get an outcome, which in a world where, political leaders, countries, individuals everywhere are we're in a norm kind of destroying error. This was a very kind of contained exercise in how do you get to the truth and what are the facts.
And I guess I should add that while there were those instances where the court had to ask people to take things down or remove things that they'd reported on, by and large, the court was complimentary of how the media handled the reporting of the case.
I just want to peel back the curtain a little bit because we've talked about some of the more gratuitous coverage, especially since the verdict. How did The Guardian make that decision in terms of where the fine line was between intense interest but public interest coverage?
I mean, it's a day-to-day proposition, and I think we wanted to cover it. There was global interest in it. I think one of the things we tried to bear in mind, and I think some of our reporters successfully did in their reporting, and I do want to give a shout out to Nino Bucci and Benita Kolovos and Adeshla Orr and the Melbourne team who really did a good job on reporting on this. I think one of the things they did do was make sure that we always talked about the three victims and the one almost victim of this crime, because I think the thing that was interesting about it to me is even compared to other recent murder trials, the bulk of the interest was on the alleged perpetrator, now found to be the perpetrator of the crime. So even if you think about those Victorian Highland murders where the man was found to have murdered one of two campers, that was an interesting case. The woman was a president of the CWA and they'd apparently been having an affair for a long time, the two victims, and the way that they died was a matter of contention in the case. But there wasn't nearly as much attention either on the case or on the perpetrator, the man who was eventually convicted of killing one of them, Greg Lynn, as there was on the perpetrator in this case. It was so focused on her. So to answer your question, I think one of the things we tried to bear in mind was this was a crime with three victims and a much broader group of people terribly affected by it, including the children and the community and the relatives. And it wasn't Agatha Christie. It wasn't Midsummer Murders. It was real.
Yeah, and I think making those decisions is also about looking at what other news you cover. And I think at The Guardian, I've tried to keep in mind, and I know other editors have too, making sure that this isn't the only kind of story in town, that it is a story with huge interest and one that deserves deep coverage, but that's not all we're doing. And I would note that on Monday, which is the day that we got the verdict, we had also had a reporter, Nino Bucci actually, who had been covering this, originally was sent to Yuendamu to cover the coronial inquest into the death of Kumanjayi Walker, because we also regarded that as an incredibly important story about justice in Australia. And that's something that we've also done podcast episodes on, columns on, and, covered for several years now.
And in many ways, that inquest was far more consequential in that it uncovered issues of structural racism in the Northern Territory Police. It was a much bigger, meatier story to report on than the trial. It got a lot less attention.
I remember one headline very recently. We described the case as a ghoulish fascination. Is it unavoidable that we play into the intense interest purely through the amount of coverage that we have?
I mean, to an extent, yes. And, it's hard if your readers are insatiably reading something to not write about it. I mean, that, to just say, look, we know better and you shouldn't be interested in this. And I guess you could say that going way back in history, members of the public have had a ghoulish fascination in the delivery of justice, in public executions and whatever else. It's not just a modern phenomenon. It's just something you need to balance.
And just to add to that, I guess I would say that, there is one sort of theory of what journalism is for, which is about it being, the fourth estate, holding power to account, journalism which focuses very clearly on public institutions, politics, etc. That's very important and that is core to The Guardian's mission, absolutely. But journalism is also about telling stories about people, about who we are, about how society operates. It's about, light and shade and joy and darkness. And
This was one hell of a story.
This was one hell of a story. These were real people, and I think it would be a bit sort of po-faced to sort of sit on the sidelines and say, people shouldn't be interested in this and we shouldn't cover this because, we should just send all our reporters, keeping watch on the ICAC or something, and I think that would be really disingenuous and a sort of weird judgment of our readers too, who are also interested. So I think you can walk and chew gum.
Too.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the water cooler discussion in our newsroom also.
Yeah.
Let's delve a little bit more into the interest with Erin Patterson, and you've rightly mentioned the victims at the centre of this. But there's been a lot said about the interest in her because she was a female perpetrator.
I do think that there is a heightened public interest in female perpetrators, possibly because women commit murder less often, possibly because she was not just a female perpetrator, but a very average-seeming female perpetrator. I mean, it's a myth that you should be able to sort of see who's a murderer just by walking down the street, obviously. But she sort of looked like the woman you'd see at Coles, right? Like she seemed so normal, so it's possibly that. I do think that the emphasis in many places on how she looked and her appearance and what she wore was different from how people view male perpetrators.
Yeah, I mean, no one wants to make a girl boss out of Erin Patterson, but there was a lot of very sexist commentary about her. And I guess I just echo what Lenore said about female perpetrators of crime being interesting, partly because they are more unusual, or perpetrators of murder. I think, the adage about dog bites man is not a story, but man bites dog is. So a woman who commits a mass murder, if three people is a mass murder, that's very unusual. I think that's a big part of it.
Let's look ahead at what more on this story. Do we think the media circus will continue as we progress into sentencing and onwards?
The sentencing will be happening in probably September, maybe August. We're still waiting to find out whether Erin Patterson's lawyers are going to lodge an appeal. But in the meantime, this industry is only just getting going. I mean, there are still 5 daily podcasts. There's an ABC drama series being prepared. I think there's potentially 2 or 3 books being written. Just suffice to say, this is going to go on for a while.
It's extraordinary that there's still an appetite. I feel like I've had my fill, but clearly there's an audience.
I do think it could wane a little as the ability to bring new facts to the table. Like I've noticed a little bit of a drop-off of interest, I think, in our readers' interest in stories. Once you get an appeal, I think that will turbocharge things again. But I think, people will keep this going for as long as they can, but readers may find something else shiny and new eventually.
All right, let's talk about what we can't get out of our heads. Lenore.
I really loved a story that Andrew Stafford wrote about Rocking Horse Records, which is a teeny little record shop in Brisbane, which I patronised a lot in my youth because it was one of those places you could go during the Bjelke-Petersen era and just kind of, breathe a little bit. And I sort of vaguely know the owner through friends. The story was about the owner's victory against charges that were sort of fueled by the totally ridiculous moral outrage that he sold records where the lyrics included the word fuck. And I do remember the case, but I'd actually left Queensland by then. But I loved the detail that part of the way that they won the case was pointing out that Rain Man, which was a movie that had won an Academy Award that year, used the word fuck 17 times. So if they were going to ban the Dead Kennedys and other bands from Warwick's teeny little record shop, then they would also have to ban an Academy Award-winning movie. Anyway, I liked it because it reminded me of my youth, and I also liked it because with sort of much bigger and more serious exercises of oppression at the moment, I liked to be reminded of a teeny little victory from the past.
Definitely a small win there. And things have changed now with the language that we find acceptable.
Not in other ways.
Jo, what's yours?
Well, mine is very lowbrow once again. I feel I always go there on this pod. But I keep thinking this week about the most recent episode of And Just Like That, which is mine and a lot of other women's favourite hate watch, the Sex and the City spin-off, which this week it's a show that is renowned for its terrible, terrible writing. The writers seem to not only have never watched an episode of Sex and the City before the show that it's based on, but maybe never ever borne witness to a conversation between human beings. That's how bad the dialogue is. But last week they committed the cardinal sin of a character whose father died in season 1. We're now in season 3, got the terrible news that her father had just died. And we went to this man's funeral. Like, that is how bad the writing is getting. But the takes on And Just Like That are only getting better as the show gets worse.
And you're still watching it.
And I'm still watching it.
That is very tragic. I think they need one of those storyboards.
Doubly tragic.
Where they're doubly tragic.
The poor man.
The poor characters have to go through it all again. Lenore, Jo, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Reged.
Thanks, Reged.